1 year on, from the start of his brutal war, Putin has failed to achieve a single one of his strategic goals. Instead of dividing the European Union, he finds us united and determined to stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes. Instead of dominating the global energy market, he has seen his main source of revenue slashed. Instead of wiping Ukraine from the map, he is confronted with a nation more vigorous than ever.
And for more on how Europe has united around Ukraine, France 24's Europe editor Armin Georgian is here with us in the studio. Hello again.
Hello.
We're seeing lots of commemorations and words of support today across Europe. But how has this past year looked in terms of tangible monetary, military support for Ukraine?
Well, there's been support from the West in the broader sense of that term. So Australia, Japan, G7 members, you mentioned that in your introduction. If we look at the two big blocks of support, the US and the European Union, this is what one most commonly focuses on. And at the moment, we can see the US has actually overtaken the Europeans' commitment. So the US now has 73 billion euros in earmarked support to the EU's 54.9 billion. Obviously, put everything in euros there so we can compare more easily. But it's worth saying, Charlie, that actually at the end of December, the EU overtook the United States when it announced that big financial aid package for Ukraine at the end of last year. So these things kind of, they are in flux, but very roughly the EU and the US are comparable. And one very senior official I spoke to told me recently that actually the burden sharing on both sides of the Atlantic has been roughly equal, because even though the US is a much bigger military donor, you also have to factor in other things like refugee flows, energy costs. Those things impact Europe more than they impact America.
Now, Ukraine is, of course, a part of the European continent, but it is not an EU member. This week, you spoke to Ukraine's ambassador to the EU, and he has been pushing hard for Ukraine to be more closely aligned with the EU. How did he sound about his country's prospects?
Well, Ukraine applied to join the European Union just 4 days after the war started, and then Ukraine got candidate status in June. So European integration was always at the core of Ukraine's response to February the 24th. Let's take a listen to the Ukrainian ambassador to the EU, Vsevolod Chensov.
What we have achieved during 1 year is definitely unthinkable on normal EU standards. We have received the status of the candidate country. We started quite swift implementation of those 7 steps which were suggested by the European Commission and endorsed by the Council. And we have quite advanced on this way. But it's not only about the speed, it's about the quality of reforms. And we want to make it to make sure that Ukraine needs reforms. It's not that EU imposing reforms. We are not ticking the box. We understand that we need to complete justice system reform to make sure that anti-corruption bodies are functional.
Brussels keeps stressing that there is no fast-track procedure as such, Charlie. It's up to every EU candidate country to go as fast as it wants to go. And I think, as you heard from the ambassador there, Ukraine has chosen to go fast. But it's one thing for a country to be a candidate and another thing for a country to actually have started formal accession negotiations, which Ukraine has not reached yet. At that point, a country has to adopt this vast body of EU legislation known as the acquis communautaire into its national law. That's a huge job for a country at war. It's a particularly big challenge, and Ukraine obviously is going to have to mobilize some massive administrative resources to actually achieve that. So I think for now we can see Ukraine has gone at a pretty fast pace, but we'll have to see what happens if and when it actually formally begins accession talks with the EU.
Europe editor Armin Georgian, thank you so much for your reporting and analysis.